All right, the 1 to 4 family contract, paragraph 6D, objections. So now that the buyer has received the survey and the buyer has received the title commitment along with the restrictive covenants, now the buyer is going to have time to object to what was found if they don't like what was found. So let's get into it. The buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to title. So when they get this and there's exceptions to coverage they don't like, or there's an encumbrance on the title they don't like, or something, a defect on the survey or an encumbrance on the survey, they now have the opportunity to object. Now, there are exceptions to that. Disclose on the survey other than items 6A through 7 above or 6A through 9 above, meaning they already are aware that they're not going to be able to object to these items. Right? So at this point, they still can object to those items that come in, because if they want additional coverage for minerals, they have to get their own work done, right? Their own research done by a landman, as we discussed earlier, or an oil and gas attorney, right? So they can't object to those things, right? But they can object to anything they put here. Now, if that prohibit the following use or activity, what we mean here is if the buyer knows that they're going to build a pool, or they want to store their RV on their property, or a boat, or put up a 10-foot fence, or whatever it is that they want to do, if they want to rent the property, right? Let's say they're buying it as a rental. They might put residential rental, right? Now they're going to be able to object to that. If they know that they're going to want to do an Airbnb, I would prohibit if I get an exception or an encumbrance or something that says I can't have a short-term rental. That might be something I want to object to, so I would put that there. Now they're probably going to be able to object anyway to those things, but I want to write it there because the seller might be aware they can't put a pool. The seller might be aware they can't put a 10-foot fence or do a short-term rental, and we won't even have a contract at that point. But if there's anything that they want to do to the property, that's where we would put that. Maybe it's a 20 by 20 shed that's 16 feet tall. Put that in there, right? Because if that shows up, I want to be able to object to that. Now, once they receive everything, right, the buyer must object to the seller by the closing date or the negotiated number of days after the buyer receives the title commitment and the exception documents and the survey. So once they receive all three of these things, which we talked about above, they're going to have a certain number of days to read and object. They should have at least 5 days, if not more, because they need time to get them. They need time to be off of work over the weekend, whatever it is that they want to read those things. If they're going to be on vacation, if they have a heavy workload, I might ask for more days. Now, the idea here isn't to allow them to object all the way up to closing or to give them 30 days to object. I do want that buyer to get these documents, pay attention to them, and read them, and encourage them to read them so that if they want, they can object. Now, what does it mean to object? This happened on a house that we were buying. The buyer wanted to put a pool in the yard, but there was a setback line. Well, they objected to that and they wanted to get a pool built. And so the seller took the plans that the buyer had provided to the city, and the city said, yes, you can build your pool, and we moved forward. So the seller was able to take care of that. Maybe they want to put up a taller fence, but the rules won't let them and they need to get a variance. The seller could apply for a variance for that and have time to cover that objection, right? So how do they do that? Well, according to the contract, the buyer has so many days to object. Now, here's something interesting. The buyer's failure to object within the time allowed will constitute a waiver by the buyer to object. So if they get the documents and they don't object within the time negotiated, they waive the right to object after that day. So it's important that the buyer read these. Okay. The buyer shall not be obligated to incur, I'm sorry, the seller is not obligated to incur any expense to cure the objections. What that means is the seller does not have to cure the objections if it's going to cost them money or time. Okay. Now they're going to want to cure the objections if they want to sell the property, but if it gets too expensive or it's too timely, they may not cure those objections. Okay. Now the lender might have some objections that we want the seller to also cure. Now, the seller has up to 15 days, which is called the cure period, to cure any objections. Okay. If that cure period, and they haven't cured it yet, goes beyond the closing date's going to be extended through the cure period for those up to 15 days. So your closing date could automatically be extended if we're trying to get something cured. Okay. If objections are not cured by the cure period, the buyer may, by delivering notice to seller within 5 days after the end of the cure period, terminate the contract and get a refund of the earnest money, or they could waive the objections. Now, at this point, if they want to continue, then I would want, as a seller, in writing that the buyer is going to waive the objections that they had proposed earlier. That just protects everybody, rather than just going forward and closing. Have them waive the objections. Right now, if the buyer does not terminate within the time required, the buyer shall be deemed to have waived the objections. So contract right here states, if they don't terminate within that 15-day cure period, plus the 5 days afterwards, if they don't terminate within those 5 days, then the buyer would have waived their objections at that point. So the buyer has to put it in writing that they want to terminate. If they don't, then they're waiving the right to object. Okay. Now here's something else interesting. If the title commitment or the survey is revised, or there's any new exception documents that are delivered, the buyer may object to any new matter, right, within the same time stated above. So whatever time they put here, if we get a new survey, if we get new title commitment, if we get new exception documents, the buyer will have another number of days, whatever days here, to object, and we will go back to the 15 days to cure and such. Okay. So again, the buyer has the right to object. Make sure the buyer reads through those documents. Something that agents will do sometimes is take it on themselves to read the deed restrictions and the commitment, right, and the survey, and make a decision on behalf of our client. We don't get to make decisions on behalf of our client. Our client has to read these documents. Once you take on that responsibility, you open yourself up to liability. I'm not saying don't read the documents, but tell your buyer they have to read these documents, and if there's any objections, they have to let you know. Okay. Sometimes these documents can be 20 pages, sometimes they're 100 pages. They have to go through and read them if that's important to them. Okay. So again, make sure that they read it, make sure that they object in a timely manner, and make sure that in paragraph 21, their information is there so the title company can send them all of these documents that are necessary. Make sure your client's information is in paragraph 21.